Welcome to Lab the Podcast. Honored to spend some time with David Clayton, an internationally known artist, teacher, writer, and broadcaster who divides his time between Princeton, New Jersey, and Oxford, England. Academically, his interests are focused on transforming contemporary culture through beauty, innovation, and creativity. David has a bachelor's and a master's in material science from Oxford University and a master's in metallurgical engineering from Michigan Technological University. He has trained as an iconographer in the Byzantine tradition with renowned iconographer Aidan Hart in England, as well as portraiture and the academic method of naturalistic painting and drawing developed in the High Renaissance in Florence, Italy. He's currently the provost of a Catholic university where he's designed the unique Master of Sacred Arts program, and since the fall of 22 has held the position of artist in residence for the Scala Foundation in Princeton, New Jersey. Spending time now in the United States from England, where he is the artist in residence at Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts in New Hampshire, where many of his works hang in their chapel. He's authored papers and academic articles, but as well as books like The Way of Beauty, which is what we're going to be drawing from today. The Vision for You, Little Oratory and Painting in the Nude. So, David, thank you so much for sharing time with us. I enjoyed your book. A friend introduced me to it, and I've worked through it once. I'm working through it a second time, but thank you so much.
Yeah, just one little correction. The book's called Painting the Nude, not Painting in the Nude.
Got it. See, these attention to detail. This is why you're an engineering
Yeah,
master.
I have clothes on. Yeah,
There you
okay.
go. There you go. Well, as I said, The Way of Beauty is how I was introduced to your work, and it was through a friend who's familiar with our work for strategic evangelism and the leading edge with beauty. And he passed me this book. He said, "You have to read David's book." And as I went through it, it was so helpful to me, so impactful to me that I'm going through it a second time. And I was thinking about our conversation and thought we could spend time on every single chapter, but I'm going to be careful with our time and just hit a few of the high points in your book. But I think the best place to start is how and maybe why someone with advanced degrees from Oxford in engineering and material science comes to write a book on beauty. If you could just give us some context for the book and why you decided to write on beauty. Let's start there and then we'll kind of dive in.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here today. So I was lost really in my mid-20s, and there's a whole story connected with that, and that eventually ended up with me converting to Christianity as I was searching for an answer. Um, but part of that was really becoming dissatisfied with what I was doing, looking for a calling in life. And as I was searching for God at the same time, trying to reconcile both searches in a sense. And so I decided that I wanted to become an artist. And I talk about some of that process in my book, The Vision for You. I was given some insightful vocational guidance by a friend of mine, which I wrote about. But the question then is, if I'm going to be an artist, how do you train? Where do you get the training? I looked at most of the art that I saw around me, and I didn't like it. Most of what was fashionable, most of the art that I saw, contemporary artists painting, and so I thought, well, I want to train to serve the church. So what do? You go to an art school that teaches Christian art. And so I looked it up under C in the London telephone directory where I was at the time, and it didn't exist. And then I found that it didn't really exist anywhere. So I realized that I was going to have to find aspects of this training myself, and even once I'd learned the skills, get an understanding of the traditions of producing art. And I became a Catholic, so I was looking particularly at that tradition, but not exclusively. I wanted to know what made the art that appealed to me beautiful as I saw it. Was it just my opinion, or are there some guidelines that can guide the artist if they want to paint beautifully? And it was in the course of effectively trying to teach myself that I did research into how artists used to be taught. And so what I found was that aside from learning the skills, which that's difficult enough to get, I mean, not many art schools don't even teach proper drawing and painting skills today. But even assuming you can get that, there is a process of enculturation whereby artists are given an understanding of how their art can conform, if you like, to a Christian vision of beauty and the world. And the starting point for the understanding of this is the beauty of creation. So we look at the beauty of the world around us. There's generally a consensus that that's beautiful. So if we consider the human response to that, maybe we can create things that participate in, to use a sort of high phrase, cosmic beauty. So the idea being that everything that is beautiful is either made by God or else made by somebody else, by man, say, but God inspires its creation. And so, in effect, what happened is I learned those lessons, I absorbed them as best I could myself through personal research. And then I felt that if I was correct in what I'd learned, then this is something that others would want to know about. So I wrote the book.
Yeah. It's there's so many things I want to pull on. Before I dive into a couple things you particularly said about beauty, I ordered
Mm,
that other book, The Vision for You, and I'm curious, in your 20s, if
mm.
you look back earlier now, would you say that there was an instinct or an intuition, some evidence towards your vocation as an artist early in your life that having had that mentor help you understand vocation, you're able to look back and say, ah, I see the crumbs, I see the things leading up to that that I didn't have eyes to see at the time, but it was always there. It was latent maybe in my childhood and in the early adolescent years, and then I went to Oxford. I pursued what I thought was the design, the way that I was going to go make a career and make a living. But this thing was still there. When you look back in your story, is there evidence of David the artist there that was hidden to you, or was it there and you wrestled against it and there was a big should leaning over you? Or I'm just curious about that.
In my case, certainly yes. It's not true for everybody. I've mentored people since, and sometimes you have to tease it out. But I'd always wanted to be an artist. I'd never had the nerve to believe that I could do it. And uh, one of the things that happened is when I met this guy, David, who was influential in my life, he encouraged me to believe that it was possible. But what he did first, and I didn't realize that this is what he was doing, was helping me to establish a relationship with God, and then to start asking questions about what I wanted to do. And the premise that he had was that if that God wants us to be happy, which sounds pretty radical, but I believe that's true. He wants, he wants us to know Him so that we can be happy in this life and the next, as many would say, and that it's very likely that He wants us to do what we want to do. Now, we can go astray on that basis. So we need to examine whether what we want to do is good. If it's inherently bad or sinful, then clearly we disregard that. And as you know, the thing about temptation is that it's very tempting. We're attracted to it. And so we have to be able to filter that stuff out. So guidance from a mentor is good. And then also a spiritual life. And the other thing is that it was only once I had a faith in God that I could put aside the fear of failure and the fear of what might happen if I didn't, if I pursued it and didn't achieve my aims. That was as much holding me up as anything else, I would say. And once we went through this process, but once I realized that's what I wanted to do, just to give you the general picture of his advice. He just said, aim for the highest. If it's meant to be, God can make you the new Michelangelo. You know, if he did it once, he can do it again. Why not you? It might be that, it might not be, but we don't plan the path all the way. We just take the next step, and then once we've taken the first step, we wait we look for the next opportunity. So we don't plan the second until we've done the first. And the first is always something very ordinary and straightforward and practical. So in my case, believe it or not, I'd always been an artist, but I'd never taken this first step, which actually enlist for some art classes at the local art school, because I just assumed it wasn't, you know, there was no chance that I could do it. So it was about listening to the vision, being discerning, but allowing that to blossom, I would say.
Yeah. I'm gonna at the end of this probably ask you to have a second conversation about that. I think so many people
Love to.
struggle with that, and you know, the
Yeah.
idea of even vocation, and that there is a calling, and that presupposes a caller, and how do I make sense
Yeah.
of that? How do I discern that voice from my own voice? Do I have the freedom to do that? So many things there. So we'll have to put a comma on that one. Do you think that the instinct or the intuition to beauty drew you to Oxford? Is it because Oxford was beautiful that you ended up at Oxford, or was that a different?
Uh, no, I mean, Oxford and Cambridge dominate in England, you know, where I grew up. So if anybody has a chance to go, they are the premier universities, so you will go. And I was encouraged to. I had to take the exams, and I passed, so I went. I will say that once I got there, I think that the beauty of the town, and I was just there last year again, and it is striking to me how beautiful the colleges are and how well they have done in preserving that beauty. They're very secular places now. They originally Oxford was established with a strong foundation in faith, uh, but even as secular institutions, the colleges are aware that they have something special and work very hard to preserve that. And so, new building, for example, has to be done in harmony with what was there. That's not always the case. In Princeton, I would say, there's a bit of a clash between the old and the traditional. I mean, it's not that a lot of it was built at the turn of the last century in the 1930s, but um, Oxford is so beautiful. It did stimulate in me, I think, a desire for more of it, I would say.
Yeah. I will maybe come back around to that. I loved your conversation about the dining hall as a little chapel almost. And I was just, my wife
Yes.
and I were just in Oxford, and I was struck by walking through a dining hall and just thinking you know, how impoverished we are in the West and down here in the Southeast, like architecture and even our universities. There's areas that they're not just not inspiring. They're like, they repel you almost because of their
Yes.
ugliness. And here you have a
Yeah.
dining hall that lifts your vision upward, and it was remarkable. So I loved your writing on that. We'll circle back to it, but I think this is the
Yeah.
point. This maybe gets us into the book, that walking through Oxford, I felt in my body that I was nested within a beautiful, ordered world. And it felt good. It felt wonderful
Mm.
to be there, right? And you mentioned just a moment ago cosmic beauty, and I loved the way that you put language around what intuitively I think we feel, but maybe in the modern world we've been trained to reject, which is that there
Mm.
is an ordered reality that is beautiful. What is your
Yes.
definition of when you say cosmic beauty? uh, I kind of relax because I've come to have a love for that language, but that wasn't originally the way maybe I would have reacted. But give us definition. What do you mean by cosmic beauty?
Yeah. So I realize it sounds like it's coming out of a sort of a sci-fi movie or something, but I'm literally referring to the cosmos, which is so creation, the universe, God's world. But the Greek word cosmos is very interesting because it means what we think of it today, what an astrophysicist would refer to the cosmos as space or the universe. Um, but also it means beauty. The word cosmetic comes from that, and it means order. In the mind of the ancient Greeks, when we apprehend beauty, what we're apprehending is the sense that there is an order, a pattern, if you like, that underlies it, and it's that we're delighting in. We're seeing an underlying pattern, and the assumption also is that very often, I don't know if it's always the case, but very often you can describe that mathematically, just as with music. We respond intuitively to the beauty of a piece of music, but somebody can analyze the mathematics of that, and the harmony and the relationship of melody and counterpoint and harmony, all of these things, and describe it mathematically after the fact. The starting point is we look at it and we find it beautiful. And the the proof, if you like, that the mathematics is true is that if it is, we can then construct a building based upon that mathematical analysis, such as Magdalen College, Oxford. They analyzed music, they analyzed the rhythms and patterns that they saw, even in medieval times, in the motion of the planets and the changes in uh, the motions in the cosmos, and then abstracting from that certain mathematical patterns that they felt represented that, they then built the proportions of the buildings using that mathematics. And the proof of whether or not it works is, do many people find Oxford beautiful? And I would say 10 million people a year can't be wrong. That's the number of visitors who go there every year. And they're not looking at the engineering building, which was built in the 1970s and is, to coin a phrase, ugly as sin. Nobody goes and has a look at that. It looks like your standard high rise. They go to the buildings that were built on this assumption that there is an order that underlies all that is beautiful, and primarily the cosmos, the created world, because it bears the thumbprint of God. All of this emanates from a faith in God, the idea that when we see the beauty in the world, we're discerning not just what it is, but who made it in some way at an intuitive level.
Yeah. I loved it. You set fire to my heart and imagination with your writing from saying this is beautiful and true, and there's a reason why you respond in the way you do, why you feel the way you do. And I feel like that's why I'm so passionate about, especially a young generation that is drawn, 10 million people. Intuitively, we know what is beautiful, we're drawn toward it, but we've been told that that's actually not true, and to discard that and to suppress that desire or to challenge that desire, or that it's novel, immature,
Yeah.
it's less artistic to be drawn to that ordered beauty than it is to be drawn to something that you find ugly. And yet again, we take trips up to the Chicago Art Institute, and the modern wing is empty. There's nobody there.
Mhm.
And I mean,
Yeah.
it's very, the places that are packed, the places that people are standing and you can't get to the front to behold a piece of art, are not. It's not the modern wing, and
Yeah.
w- w-
Yeah, I just wanted to. I couldn't agree with you more. I have this habit of jumping in because I get so enthusiastic. So,
go. I
but
invited you.
I would say that you're absolutely right. And as a rule, this is so natural to us that you have to have many years of education right up to university to educate you out of common sense and what people believe intuitively. It's hard work, but our universities work very, very hard at doing it. Exactly as you described, telling you that you don't have, you're not sophisticated if you don't believe this, and that you don't understand. And it's interesting because very often they will use arguments against a sort an elitism, a traditional elitism, but in fact, they are the elitists in their arguments. They're going against what most people believe. And I always think of if you imagine a dinner party with the standard 8 people around the table or something like that, and the conversation arises about art, you'll have me on the one hand, sort of pushing aggressively traditional values and beauty. You'll have one person pushing against me who believes in modernism, shall we say. And then you'll have 6 people who will just shrug their shoulders and say, well, I don't really know.
Mm.
But if you push those 6 people and say, well, what do you actually think? Which do you prefer? Most of them will go for the traditional, I would say.
Yes. Well, and I think the struggle for me is you you describe, in fact, you have a photograph of a particular street that we walk down where the Eagle and Child is, and you're talking about the proportion of the window size and how in architecture this pattern and proportion is visible in architecture, and when we see it we are drawn to it. We recognize a beautiful building and those proportions are represented, and you take a picture of a street and you're intuitively drawn to this street, not that street. uh, what At what point in history would you kind of drop a pin and say modernism really there was fuel to the fire of this modernist movement that really took an aggressive push to say we're going to do a long march uh, educationally to try to shift the perspective? When did that shift take place?
Okay. Well, intellectually, it really began with the Romantic movement, which just said it's all about how I feel, and there is no reality out there. And so it has its roots going back to Rousseau or somebody like that. I mean, you can follow the train of logic back and argue about where it begins. That one of the first people to really reject, to take that and then reject the idea of objective beauty and the existence of harmony and proportion as standards that can be learned, ironically, is Edmund Burke, who in many ways was pushed traditional lines in things. You know, he was horrified by the French Revolution, which in itself created a movement that uh, politically, shall we say, ushered in a lot of the rejection of the traditional values. But Burke himself rejected this traditional idea of beauty in his aesthetics. And so these ideas began to catch on, gradually gaining speed. I would say, though, that it starts to accelerate with the 20th century, particularly around the turn of the last century. So in architecture, you still have strong traditional movements, but there's something called the Bauhaus, where they consciously rejected traditional ideas. And you have their equivalent in art and in music, dissonance in music, for example. And they knew that they were rejecting the traditional worldview. They knew that it went further than just the music or the architecture or the art. They were making statements and they wanted to reject Christianity. And they recognized that traditional understanding of beauty came from a Christian worldview, and they hated it. They were trying to push it, push the opposite, the atheist materialist worldview very often. Now, this really began to take hold and became the norm, I would say, after the Second World War. So once you get past the Second World War, no architects are learning traditional harmony and proportion. And even those that are aware that there are problems with what they're doing and they're trying to produce something beautiful will resist the idea that they can benefit from a little bit of mathematics. They just don't want to believe it's true because they have this sense, it's so ingrained in them, that this is restricting creativity, that the creative impulse has to be something that emanates from me and is linked to emotion somehow. which is the way that mainstream art works today. Um, Whereas in the past, people would have viewed it very much like, if you want to compose music, you composers have original ideas for melodies, but you can't do it unless you know the rules of harmony and the structure of music. Just random notes, as they appeal to me, the chances of that producing anything that anyone else will listen to are slim. Yet effectively, that's the principle by which modern architecture and modern art works. And also, I would say, actually, modern music in classical music, that's why nobody listens to it. And you have the rise of popular forms which are filling the vacuum. At least they have a tune that
Mm.
you can hum, should we say.
It's so interesting to hear you describe that. And, somebody, a friend said, we're all Nietzsche's grandchildren. We live in this disenchanted world. And I think that's what strikes me as having just been in Oxford and feeling what I felt there. And we came back, and after reading your book, we just recently took a trip to the beach, and my son and I were on the beach, and he said, "Dad, let's build something, right? Let's build something." And I had your book was saturating me, and so I said, "Let's build a cathedral." And so we built it with my layperson's, guess at proportion, but
Mhm.
a rectangle emerged, and height, and the window height, and all these things started to emerge. And I stepped back and I looked at that, and I thought it is enchanting. It does draw you toward it, versus something that I would have built 2 summers ago, having not read your book. And so I'm deeply grateful that you took the time to write, because I have the sense, like you, and I didn't go to train as an artist, but there isn't a resource, or there isn't as many resources for us. We feel like the horizon has been wiped, and we are falling forward and backward and sideward in all directions. That's the
Mm,
felt experience. And then somebody does the work that you've done and says it's okay. Like, it's like a ground comes under your feet and says you have cause to stand on something firm, and to actually not be embarrassed by it, but be emboldened by it. It is okay to feel the way you feel about beauty. There is an objective quality to it.
mm,
We were talking earlier, though, that the immediate reaction then for the artist is to say, "But I've been trained, as you have articulated for us, not to believe that instinct, and that it's
mm.
stifling to creativity." What do you say to the artist who says, "But if I draw from tradition, and if I just," I think your chapter where you described that the training in art was for the masters was to paint somebody else's painting or draw somebody else's drawing over and over and over again. And that's how you perfected the craft, so that then you could
Yes.
make something new. What do you say to the artist who says fundamentally that it is stifling to creativity to put those kind of constraints, and to say drawing from tradition it opens the door to creativity? What would you say to somebody who says no, it doesn't? It has to be self-expression.
Okay. Well, the first thing is to think about what we mean by creativity. Most people think I need to produce something original or different. Now, um, let's accept that. So we could argue about that. You might say that traditionally you conform to tradition, so you worked within certain parameters, but nevertheless, still everyone had their own voice. And I would say to people, um, look at, for example, architecture is always a good one to use because the mathematics are obvious in the proportions of the building. So you can see there's something mathematical happening there because you can't avoid it. You've got to have dimensions defined for the building, and they can be measured and ascertained. So if my premise is correct, I would say, then when they abandoned the ideas that I'm proposing, you would have seen an explosion of forms and a variety of forms in architecture that would be beautiful and people would flock to see them. Now, you see people trying to initiate things, and you have all these isms, as they call them, various movements and reactions. It's very fractured. Ultimately, it comes down to the individual separated from everything else in that modern vision. But the result is the same wherever you go. Where if you go to New York, Singapore, Tokyo, Delhi, you couldn't tell where you were in terms of the modern architecture. It's all the same. It's as though their very attempts to be different end up being the same. And what I would say is that that is a reflection of the fact that there is no order outside God's order, only disorder. There is no beauty outside God's beauty, only ugliness. Let's look at the situation prior to that. You have a wealth of styles within, not just within the Christian world, the Western tradition, but you can look at many other traditional civilizations across the world who worked on this assumption that there is a mathematical order. It wasn't just the West. And you can distinguish between Western Europe, Eastern Europe, India, Japan, China, and even within something like the Gothic tradition or the classical tradition, you recognize different streams within it. And the variety is huge. There are large numbers of traditions. What links them is the perception generally, I would say, in many people that they are beautiful and worth seeing. And the variety is high. And so it's exactly the opposite. Where you're drawing on God's inspiration, there are universal principles that underlie it, and they can be distilled from it, and they're the same in each case. But the application of them, the manifestation of them, is as different as the number of people that there are. So I work within a tradition of iconography, which is a particular style of sacred art, very clearly defined, very tight parameters as to if you stray outside them, it's not an icon, it might be something else, but it's not an icon. But within the traditions of iconography, you can recognize, well, an expert could recognize, like my teacher, probably not like me, like Aidan Hart, he could recognize to within 50 years and within a tight geographical region where an icon comes from, just from its style, because people reflect not only their personal experience and their personal way of doing things, but their locale and their time. But it happens naturally and organically. It's not sought after as an end in itself. And it's rather like happiness. Beauty is like happiness. If you strive for it, it evaporates as you grasp for it. But if you if you strive for it directly, but if you do the things that we know lead you along that path, it just comes to you. It works its way out through you if you follow that. And that actually is the natural voice. It's like the principles of the faith, I would say. I mean, there are underlying principles, but we're all unique. We all have a unique life that expresses those principles if we lead a life of virtue in a glorious and personal way that speaks not just of God who's inspiring us, but of me personally. I am different from you in a beautiful way, and we're both beautiful. It's as varied as the number of people, as the 6 billion people on Earth. We're all unique and different, but we're all human.
Mm. I think as I hear you describe that, I hear these hints of, beauty reflects something beyond it, beyond itself. And so there's something, and to stitch back a definition of beauty, maybe that it's something beyond us. And I think in your book, you draw out Aquinas's definition saying that it delights us. It's something that delights us. If you had to give a definition of beauty, if we were to say, okay, David, I hear you, the story you're telling. I believe it. I resonate with it, and I'm willing to follow down that road and say beauty is objective. if you could give us a definition that we could then take and say, hey, something individual and unique and organic is going to come from us, but we're going to be working from a similar definition. How would you define beauty?
Yeah, so they always need explanation. I don't because immediately objections occur. So if we take the Aquinas, that which pleases when seen we call beauty. The question is, well, is it anything you please? Doesn't do different things please different people? Well, he would say that if we are pure, he's assuming certain things, and by um, pleases, he means that that which appeals to the higher part of us. In other words, the same aspect of us that is searching for God, in a way. Now, he's assuming all that. He didn't write a thesis on aesthetics. He almost includes it as a throwaway line, shall we say, in his work. Another way of putting that is the radiance of being. In other words, when we see clearly what something is, we recognize it for what it is and we delight in it because everything in its being participates in God's being, that in some way its existence derives from God. God made it, and we recognize that. So now there would need to be a lot of explanation, I think, beyond that, and probably beyond the scope of this what we have today, because immediately objections arise, and I understand that because everyone says, well, there's a variety of opinions, and this doesn't seem to sort it out. But what I would say is that I think of it more like our ability to accept the faith, for example, and to accept God. Some people reject him, some people accept it, but it doesn't change the fact that God exists and that God is not changing dependent upon what I believe or what you believe, your perception of him, my perception. What's changing here is that we have different abilities or different inclinations to accept God, to have faith in God. The problem is in us, it's not in God.
Mm,
And beauty is simply what you might call a visible sign or a perceptible sign of God's work in some way.
mm,
And we delight in it if we delight in God. Those who hate God don't delight in it. They hate it and they promote ugliness. So atheistic, materialistic societies have brutalism as their standard in architecture.
mm,
And they don't hide the fact, they don't claim that that's beautiful. They say, we're not interested in beauty because they know that they're not interested in God. And so for me, the easiest way to understand this is it's the mark of something that is created by God, or else God inspired its creation.
mm.
And so the culture of man, we want to be inspired by God, and we hope, therefore, it participates in the same beauty, the same order that God introduced into creation itself.
Mm. I love that. There's so many. I think you said it. We could have 7 or 8 different conversations under each of these points, which is why,
Yeah.
uh, again, the book is The Way of Beauty, and David Clayton's the author. So go find it. If you're listening to the conversation, this is interesting. You do. I really encourage you to get the book, work through it. I'm on my second pass through it, and it's going to be so helpful to all of us. I want to ask before we run out of time, you carry us all the way through these kind of big ideas, and then you get to the back of the book and you call out 3 particular styles of art that you say are particularly helpful in the Christian tradition or have been helpful historically in serving the
Mm.
church. You talk about the Baroque architect or Baroque style. You talk about iconography. You talk about Gothic art. Why those 3 styles? What was it about those 3 styles, from Baroque to Gothic to iconography, that are particularly important in the Christian tradition?
Okay. So I'm speaking here as a Catholic, and I'm citing an authority who would be Pope Benedict XVI. So it's in his estimation. So this is not a dogmatic truth or anything. It's his judgment. He wasn't speaking with papal infallibility or anything, but Um, I accept it, one, because I respected him, but also it seems to coincide with my own judgment. So it's convenient for me to draw on him. But as a general principle, what are they trying to judge here? So these are what he's referring to are liturgical styles. In other words, art that goes with worship. And the question then is, what makes art worthy of worship? Well, if our worship is good, then the art that deepens our participation in it effectively enhances our encounter with God. And that's the purpose of that art. It isn't just how I feel or whether I like it. It's we're looking to see whether it has a particular effect on me. Now, how do you judge whether a particular style of art actually increases somebody's encounter, the intensity of somebody's encounter with God? Very difficult to tell, of course. Even asking people is not always the best guide. So the answer is that over generations, centuries, it is observed that certain styles of art working in conjunction the uh, our worship, which we consider to be the primary encounter with God, the place where we bare our souls, shall we say, to receive Him most profoundly, um, seems to result in generally people living a life of virtue, a good Christian life. Excuse me. And so that's not something that you can look at in an experiment just by introducing a piece of art into a church. You can't measure the faith scientifically. It's impossible. It's not a natural science. I know because I studied it at university. Is about the material world. And so anything beyond the material world, you have to make judgments in different sorts of ways. But the, it has been observed over the course of centuries that these styles seem to enhance the participation of Christians in worship, and and if that is the case, they live lives as better Christians. They go out into the world and they love their neighbor and they love God through neighbor, shall we say. Um, Now, that's something that is you observe over a long period of time. Now, have they got it right? Well, no one can prove whether yes or no, I would say. But if we have an inclination to believe tradition and say, well, if they were looking for that over a long period of time, that should at least be a starting point for where we begin now. And we we can experiment in outside the church. That's the place to try things out, try new things. We do need change, but in terms of what we have in the church, which is what affects us most profoundly when we worship God, the I would be much more cautious about changing things. I would say, let's go with tradition and just change things incrementally. But on the whole, we want to trust the experience of centuries of Christians who've spent a long time developing these styles gradually and steadily over periods of time.
Yeah. No, it's helpful. And I think even helpful for me as a parent and for everybody listening who has kids. I took that part of your book and thought about it and applied it then to my home and to the way that I want
Okay.
my kids to interact with art and what might be helpful for them and opening them up. So
Mm,
again, there are so many different chapters in the book that we could go to talk about the music of the spheres and this harmony and proportion and styles of art. So, if you're a pastor or you are a leader or you are a teacher, professor, you're working within a university system and you haven't encountered The Way of Beauty by David Clayton, I just encourage you. Here's the book. Go get it. I think what I see happening, and David, I want to ask you this. We had COVID a couple years ago. A friend of mine, brilliant person, said, Zach, we're in the long winter of disenchantment. And so this isn't going to be a snowstorm. You're just feeling what it is to be in winter. And my question was,
mm,
well, how long is winter? And when can we get to spring? And I see books like yours and conversations like this. I'm meeting artists all the time who are drawn back to maybe a more objective standard of beauty and seeing, and they're kind of exhausted with the experimentation and longing to contribute in a meaningful way. It seems to me, it's funny that in DC just said that spring has sprung and the cherry blossoms are appearing. It feels to me like we are early in the coming out of winter, but I'm an optimist and I see your book as a sign of that. I see what I hear from artists. I watch what's happening in the cultural landscape here in the West. And it seems to me that there's movement towards a more beautiful way forward. Do you feel that same way, or do you feel like that's optimistic? We're still early in a return back, or maybe a recalibration back from that heavy materialist, disenchanted, materialistic, atheistic perspective?
That's a great question. I'm an optimist by nature, so I just think it goes with the faith. I think you always have to believe it's possible, but the way I put, I think we have turned the corner, but we're not out of the woods yet. I think we're past the darkest days. I just think about when I converted in the early 90s. I know I look like I'm 27, but I'm actually 61. Uh, but I thought I was the only one who thought these things. And then John Paul II wrote something called The Letter to Artists in 1999. And I thought, this is great. There's two of us. I mean, that's how much contact I had with anybody who was actually thinking about this. Now you're seeing this is going cross denomination and it's bringing Christians together. And we're noticing, yes, a lot of interest in this. The other thing is, as you will have read, the premise of my book is that really, if we want to evangelize the culture, it begins with right worship. And then you have, if the worship is good and the art forms connected with that are in harmony with your worship, then that becomes the wellspring of a Christian culture. It works its way out, and its source is God. And at that point, it can incorporate external influences, but there's this continual flood tide of grace, if you can call it that, coming out of the worship. One of the most encouraging things that I think I see is explorations of common worship. Now, as Christians, we're being attacked on every side, and certain institutions which I think are natural to us. I recently became American, so I'm now. Last Easter I became American, so I'm very interested in this. How do we unite as a nation? And I have to say, as a Christian nation, I think that is where American values come from. I think they have their roots in England. It's the Anglo-American experience, and that is what provides the values that are so characteristically American and actually so welcoming and loving to so many people of different backgrounds. Now, if what I'm saying is correct, we need to find patterns of modes of worship where we can come together without having arguments about transubstantiation or something on Sundays, if you know what I mean. And I think the Psalms are the answer here. We invite people, my wife Margarita, I know you're going to interview very soon. We invite people into our home and we pray the Psalms together. We set up an icon corner, but the Book of Common Prayer, for example, is part of the English and the American culture, I would say, in a profound way. Many different denominations, I'm thinking of the Psalter from the Book of Common Prayer, will pray it and are happy with it. Protestant, Catholic, even Orthodox, actually, in the US, use this structure of worship, which means that we can invite people on a Thursday evening, pray evening prayer together, and that is authentic worship. It is liturgical. It's not. It points to Sunday worship, but it means we can come together and be raised up together. The difficulty with looking for common ground sometimes is its lowest common denominator religion. and basically nobody's happy. I think if we can pray the Psalms, and you talk about enchantment, the imagery in the Psalms is, it was made by God, I believe, to appeal to us who are also made by God to respond to it. It actually stimulates the imagination in a profoundly Christian way, and again contributes to what we do in the outside world, both in terms of our conduct, but also whether we do things gracefully and beautifully. And that is how we have the emergence of a culture which speaks of Christianity in every way. And I think that the psalter of the Book of Common Prayer might be, I don't know how the people who listen to this will feel, but I think even those who have never done it probably wouldn't object to praying the Psalms. We really can come together as a nation, and this can be the source of a common and powerful culture, I think, that brings us together and raises us up together. And if we have art and music, there are traditional forms of music for the Psalms, as you know, and again, that seems to go cross-denomination. These can bring us together and raise us up, and then be the inspiration for the forms that we see in the contemporary culture, which may not be overtly religious, but in some way are derived from it and speak to it in the underlying form, in the mathematical structure, in the way that they're shaped. So that is my hope, actually, and I begin to see signs of Christians doing this. I'm very hopeful for that reason.
Yeah. No, I join you in that. I think I'm encouraged by your hopefulness and by what you described there. And I think, again, in a post-Christian America, post-truth era, post, all the
Yeah,
things, I
yeah,
think that's why I love, if you talk about good and true being pretty contested spaces, I think the way of beauty is the way forward to get us into that common posture of worship. And I think, even as you were describing about the leisure as the basis of culture and a starting point of worship, if we're going to have a culture at all, then
yes,
that is the starting point for what it is to be a culture that participates in something that's bigger than us, that does pull us together. So you described that really, really well. I want to be careful of your time. I know I only had you for a short time here, but I'm so grateful for your work. I think the best thing to do is maybe ask if we can put a comment in it, because my instinct is you thought you were the one, and then you found a second, a third. I think there's thousands more, and I
yeah,
think even the
right,
people listening to this podcast are going to be so refreshed by this conversation, because you've given us language and then confidence that there is a way forward, and it may be by looking back and returning to an old way, an ancient path, that it is helpful maybe to paint, even as you described painting and learning to paint from the masters. We can learn to pray, we can learn to sing, we can learn to worship
yes,
together,
yes,
maybe by looking to things that have been lost. So I'm so grateful for you. I want to give you the last word, just encouragement moving forward from the place we find ourselves. I pick up the book, I read the book. I'm inspired to encourage artists, to participate myself in this way of beauty. If you could have a last word to all of us who are encouraged by the work that you have done, and want to keep this conversation going and to participate robustly, what would you say to all of us who are thanking you and saying,
wow,
yes, what are you inviting us
yeah,
to next?
okay. So, I mean, there's so much I could say, but I would say, if what I think is most important here, it actually it's praying the Psalms. I think add that to your Sunday worship. Try and do that. That they are so much an influence on our imaginations and what we do. That it's profound. I really believe that. The second thing is, try and do something creative in your life. What that will do is stimulate that creative impulse in you, which, even if it isn't what you're learning to do. So, if, for example, if you wanted to learn to do geometric patterns. That's something you can do mechanically. You don't need to be artistic, but you can learn to create Romanesque or Islamic patterns of intricate beauty and produce them. But anything like that, if you can sing in a choir, if you garden and for beauty, okay, anything that you're creating something for beauty, that will then stimulate your creativity, because what you're doing is you're learning to work within the pattern of the beauty of the cosmos. And even imagine you're doing something totally different. You work as in research science or something. How do I invent something new? Well, the answer is I see the pattern of what is, and then I can see what's missing. In other words, I can supply the missing piece of the jigsaw because I have a sense of the whole picture. And the way that we develop that sense of the whole picture is by learning to work within the patterns of beauty, and praying to God for inspiration. And so we pray the Psalms, do something, try and find. Margarita's talking about trying to do embroidery, for example. I've been doing art all my life, but anything that you can do, it will stimulate that creative impulse in your life. And it'll become part of your nature incrementally and gradually to do things gracefully and beautifully in every aspect of your life. And of course, this means also virtuously and lovingly. All of these things are interconnected.
Mm. It's so good. The Way of Beauty, David Clayton, Liturgy, Education, and Inspiration for Family, School, and College. I can't recommend the book more highly. And David, I'm just grateful for your willingness to dialogue and for all the work you're doing outside of just the writing. Be encouraged, be hopeful, and continue that. And we're going to invite you back for a second conversation if you're willing. I would love that. But thank you so much for
Absolutely.
sharing some time.
Absolute delight. Thank you, Zach.